Hi, it's Mike Stephenson here. In today's video, we're going to be looking at BAM within Serverless 360. So this is the Business Activity Monitoring module, and we're going to take a look at an example of using BAM with Power Automate from the Power Platform. So we're going to have this customer documentation generation scenario, and we're going to have a look at how we can provide self-service and give our support users a better experience by using Serverless 360. So if we think about our integration platform and where Power Automate fits, so we've got this sort of human workflow area where we think Power Automate's going to participate quite a lot in your integration solutions. Now, I guess with Power Automate, there's a bit more than just an integration scenario to think about. So Power Automate has use cases around if your integration platform, you're looking at the human workflow features. If you're developing solutions for Power Apps, so here you're building systems of engagement with Power Apps, it's likely that if you need any background processes, you're going to use Power Automate flows to implement that. If you're building a Dynamics CRM type solution or one of the other various flavors of the Dynamics suite, then Power Automate might be how you implement your background processes. And then you also have sort of citizen integrator scenarios where you might have a departmental solution built by, let's say, for example, the HR team build an app, or you might have a user who's automated their own kind of work with Power Automate, and then it becomes a solution that you need to manage. So these are all the scenarios where we see Power Automate popping up. And what we really want to be able to do is see if we can use Serverless 360's BAM to take the support of that solution to the next level by managing the business function and the business process that gets implemented, rather than managing the lower level flow and all of the technical challenges that brings with it. If we think about the background to Serverless 360, so we're really trying to address this scenario where a customer's built a solution on Azure, and the challenge is that all of the support ends up going to developers or Azure experts because they're the only ones who have the access, the knowledge of how to use Azure, and the experience of the solution to be able to support the application that you've built, whether it be an integration, a web app, or some other kind of app. All of the support ends up going to this person over here. So what we find is that there's all these other people that could participate in the support of your solution in the day-to-day operations, such as level 1 and level 2 support engineers. The problem is that for them, they don't have enough experience of the solution. The Azure portal may be way too complex, and there's a high risk of doing incorrect actions through lack of knowledge and lack of experience. There's access issues. And then sometimes you can have business super users who would be able to self-service the integrations that you build and self-service those automated processes, but they just don't have the access or the visibility to be able to participate in the solution. With Serverless 360, we have 4 modules. So we've got business applications, which is aimed at providing support for the Azure resources at the component level. We have Cost Analyzer, which is aimed at helping you develop a cost-focused culture to make sure that you're efficiently spending your money on Azure Cloud. We have Azure Documenter, which is trying to automate some of those repetitive documentations that you need to write so that you can meet all of the audit requirements and you can have some good governance over your solutions. And then the 4th module is Business Activity Monitoring, where we're trying to maximize the shift left of your support to allow support users to be able to go in and see business transactions rather than technical components. So instead of managing a function or a logic app, we're trying to manage a business process such as processing an order. Now, in addition to support people, we can also allow business super users. So you could have people who understand that order process could self-service the management of the orders and make sure they got through, do initial triage, troubleshooting, potentially fix some problems, and potentially submit messages. So in today's video, we're really looking at this feature, this business activity monitoring here, and we're going to look at how it can help you. Now, Through the use of business activity monitoring, this is where we're shifting support left. So you can see everything's heading this way. We've been able to reduce the support burden on the Azure expert and the developers. We allow those people to focus on delivering new solutions and delivering new value to the business. We allow the support team to be able to participate managing transactions, troubleshooting transactions, reprocessing, and dealing with that high percentage of errors where you don't need a developer to change something. You just need somebody to look at what the problem was, probably fix something in an external system that prevented the interface or the automation from executing, and then resubmit. And then where we really want to get to is allow potentially some self-service from your business users who can understand how to manage the process. They just normally don't have access to it. So this is where we're looking at the business activity monitoring feature within Serverless 360 to address these needs. The requirements for the example that we're going to look at is the business user wants a document to be triggered to be generated for a customer. We're going to implement that with Power Automate to process the creation of the document. The problem that we have is the business user has no visibility of what happens, so the Power App that their business function would own. The customer needs the document emailed to them, but they have no visibility to know if a document was successfully sent to a customer, if there was some problems with the data. So every time there's an issue, they end up raising support tickets to get that troubleshooting done. So if we take an example here, what we've got going on is over here, we've got rail cars out in the field that are being sent to customers containing product. We have a whole bunch of integration platform interfaces that have data from these rail cars telling telling Dataverse for our Power App solution what the current state of a rail car, and Dataverse is aware of which rail cars are assigned to which users. Now, Customer Manager at this point, they have no visibility of what's really happening in this Power Automate solution here. So the Power Automate's requirement is that when the customer's rail car gets delivered, an update happens in Dataverse here that would trigger this Power Automate flow. Now, the flow's intention is to then go and get data from the Dataverse. We then get a document template from SharePoint, and we would create a document kind of outlining what we've delivered to the customer, which rail car, what products in it. We'd create the document from the template, convert it to a PDF, and then we're going to use email to send that out to the customer. So there's a lot of places things can go wrong here. So the customer manager might be unhappy because maybe there was some data not configured correctly in Dataverse, so the get data might fail. There might be problems with the template, the document generation, or the email. So the customer manager is going to get frustrated when he has errors and he doesn't really see what the problem is. He has this kind of lack of visibility into what's happening in the Power Automate. So there's going to be support tickets get raised, and then the IT support person, that level 1, level 2 support person, probably doesn't have a lot of experience with Power Automate. They may be roughly aware of it. How do they know which flow to go to? How do they troubleshoot any issues? Probably not. So the escalation happens to a developer, who's the person who wrote the flow. They'll go and troubleshoot, and you've spent a lot of time and money getting somebody to troubleshoot the problem that might not have been difficult to fix. So the idea here is that we add Serverless 360's BAM module. We then can use Power Automate to have shapes added, so you can configure a connector for Power Automate to talk to BAM, and you might choose to put some actions. So let's say we put an action here, an action here, and an action here. And what we're doing is we're saying a transaction started. Here's an update of what happened, and here's some kind of success or failure scenario or whatever. Now, if we think this is a simplified diagram of the Power Automate, it might be that this Power Automate could be 30, 40, 50 shapes. It could do a lot of different data lookups and conversions and that kind of thing. So the chances are you've got a fairly complex Power Automate where a number of things can go wrong. You could then use BAM to show how far you've got through the process. You could show the data that you've got as you go through executing the process if you wanted to archive any data about the messages, what customer you're looking for and that kind of thing. And the idea here is if there's any problems or the business user wants to see what's happening, they can go into Serverless 360 and you've got this centralized portal that you can see all of the business processes executing. So they might have a customer, first off, they might just go and see, are there any errors? They might be looking for the document for a specific customer who's contacted the customer service team. So they can go and search for the records related to that customer. And then maybe there's a problem with the data. So the customer service team might realize that they've got a customer set up incorrectly because a document didn't generate. So they can go into the Power App and fix that customer's data, and then you could have them re-trigger the Power Automate, which would make it execute again, and that time it would successfully send a document. So this is an idea where the customer service team could fix their own issue without having to raise a support ticket because they can see what the problem was, they can do some basic triage, fix their own problem really quickly and give that customer a great service. If they had to escalate the call because they didn't understand what was happening, they could easily point the IT support person to that transaction who could then go and troubleshoot, and they could maybe sort out some slightly more technical issues. To say there was a problem with SharePoint, they might check the document template and make sure that was okay. And the idea is to just reduce the number of calls that end up getting escalated to the developer, which we think at the minute's usually the most common scenario, and we want that to be the exception, and most things get handled by business user self-service or level 1 and 2 IT support because they can see what's happening in the solution and can easily understand it. If we take a look at the demo over in Serverless 360 here, so I've got my tree view, which represents my business processes for the organization, and you can see I'm in my transport area down here. So for a lot of customers, this tree view is the bit that really is the first step in starting to make it easy to understand what your landscape looks like for the integrations and the business processes that you've built. So you can see here I've got a number of business processes within my transport area, and I'm looking today at the truck tracker documents down here. So you can see on the tree view, I've got some red, amber, green traffic lights showing me places where I might have problems, such as my human resource area has a current problem in that business process up here. I've got some errors in my maintenance department at the minute. The one we're looking at down here is the truck tracker today for Power Automate. So you can see here the first thing I get is a search that I've got where I've customized the search to be friendly for the this particular business process. You can see I've got my source systems CRM, my target systems, my customer email. I've got a transaction, which is the generate customer document, and you can see I've got things like product, truck ID, load ID. These might be common properties that make it easy for me to track what's going on with that particular process. So in the designer, what I would do is I'd create a transaction here. So you can see I've got this generate customer document transaction, and I've added some shapes to this transaction. So there's a simplified view of what's going on where the process triggers, we generate a document, we send the document to a customer, and then we update the Power App at the end. I can simply add a stage here just by adding a tracking name, a friendly name, and then choosing where it executes at. Now, there's a couple of things here. So when you first start, you don't have to set the diagram up completely before you start. You can start by just adding one shape, and then we'll capture the events and you'll be able to see them at runtime, and you can choose which ones you want to add a shape to the diagram for. So we'll look at that in a moment. But I would kind of create my step here. You can configure properties. So you can configure properties that might show up in that grid that you can customize what you want the user to see. So if we take a look here in this process started, you can see I've got some data that comes from the message body here, these JSON properties they're querying a message that my Power Automate's going to send to BAM, and I'll extract some properties like the truck ID and stuff. And there's a number of ways you can configure these properties with either a header, a message body JSON or XPath, and you can see here I've put some constants in just to make it easy for the user to understand what the interface does. I can also configure reprocessing here, so if you wanted to, you could configure an HTTP endpoint so that if you had a problem, you could send the message back to the Power Automate and it would re-trigger a new instance of that Power Automate. You can also choose to reprocess to a queue and event grade SFTP, and you're basically just sending that message back to be reprocessed. Now, if we go back to the runtime, you'll be able to see that I've got some instances currently running, and I can click, if we choose this one here, I can click on it and I can see what's happened. So here I've got the steps that we showed in the designer. You can see them at runtime. They're all shown as green because they were successful. If there was a problem here, the grid on the left would have shown up in red, and one of these shapes would be red to indicate there was an error. You can see I can click on the shape and I can show, here's the trigger message that started the Power Automate, and you can see there's some properties here that show me what's going on. And I also had some message context, so my Power Automate was sending the run ID and that kind of thing to BAM, so I can trace back to which run in the Power Automate flows it is. Now, if we take a look at how that gets implemented in Power Automate, so over here I've got the flow that I've built, and you can see the first thing to note is this triggers from the Dataverse. So if I open this one up, you'll see what happens is every time that row gets modified, if a certain field is modified, it triggers the flow. And the problem here is that a lot of these flow runs don't do anything because they, like here, what I'm doing is I'm getting the trigger that says that row has been updated, and then I'll go and get the data for that row, and then I'm basically checking, does the row indicate the rail car got delivered? So if it gets delivered, I need to send a document to the customer, but if it didn't get delivered, I need to ignore it. So taking a step back at the previous view, you'll see most of these runs are updates where the rail car's not been delivered yet. So that makes it really difficult for the support user to work out which run do I need to troubleshoot, because most of them are successful, but they didn't do anything. In BAM, we can focus on just showing the ones that actually processed here. So if you start your BAM transaction after the point you decide whether to process the message or not, this means that this is a much more reflective view showing what the transactions actually are doing. Now, if we look back in the Power Automate here, let's have a look at how we implement this. So if we go into the edit mode, so in the designer here, you can see we've talked about this stuff at the top, but what I've been able to do is over in the data section, I can add a custom connector. So from BAM, you can choose to get the Swagger Open API definition for our BAM module, and you can create a custom connector by just importing that Open API spec, and that sets your connector up, and you can provide your API key, and that'll allow you to send data to BAM. So at runtime, at development time, that'll give you these nice connectors where you can see here. Designer opens this up. So you can see here I've got some basic properties that I'll provide, such as the business process name, the transaction, the stage. So that'll map to a shape in the transactions designer. I can supply a message body and a message header. And you can see that there's a bit more going on in this logic app, but in this Power Automate. But what I did is I start the transaction. I'm doing some work with a PDF and SharePoint, and then I'll checkpoint to say that was successfully processed. So I can just say update the transaction and say we generated the document. I could then send the email, and I could update the transaction to say the email was sent. I can then at the end say I've updated the Power App to indicate that that the document was sent and everything's good. What you can do, so if you're using something like a try-catch pattern with a scope shape, you can then have like a catch-all error handler if you want to send an error to document to serverless 360 BAM. So you could send an error in your catch shape if you wanted, would be a good design pattern to use. But hopefully this shows using the connector, it's really easy to instrument your Power Automate. And then you start getting all of these easy to sort of manage features over here where you can go and see what's going on, troubleshoot. If you sent an error, you could have it show up in BAM if you wanted the user to be able to see that error and troubleshoot it. You then have the features like action required, so we haven't got any errors in this demo, but if there was any, they would show up in the action required to-do list. You can favorite a transaction, so I could say, add this to my favorites, and then I can easily find that later on. So you can see here's the transactions added to my favorites, so after lunchtime and come back and troubleshoot. I can assign transactions to another user or they can assign them to me. I can also implement a custom search, so I can do a query here. And I can make it so I can search by load ID, truck ID, that kind of thing. In the dashboard, so this is where you'll get an out-of-the-box dashboard that'll tell you what's going on in your process across a given time period. So let's go back 30 days. You can see I've got a bunch of stuff going through. I can choose to edit the dashboard and I can add some custom widgets. So I would choose a query. So if I've got a query that I write here, I could pick a type of chart and build a widget for the dashboard and modify it. So you might choose to add, look at a specific transaction if you've got multiple and just show some more detail about that. We looked at the transaction designer before. I guess one bit we didn't mention is I said in the designer that you can add one shape at the start and just set that up for your start transaction. Then you just add the checkpoints to your Power Automate, and what will happen is the events will come in and you'll see them in this tab here, and you'll see this mapped column would indicate whether there was a shape on the designer that matched that event. So if you have a new event comes in, there's no shape, you would see the event here, you would just see it marked with an X that it didn't map to a shape. So you can then choose to add your shapes later on and build out the BAM designer. So that just lets customers get up and running really quickly, and you can go and sort out the designer once you've got the events coming in. Lastly, the monitoring section. So we've got a few options here. If you have any events that are coming in that create incidents, you'll see the incidents show up in the list here. So in some of the other demos we've done, we've got some errors that are happening. Actually, I can probably just go and show you in this one. You would see here you've got a bunch of issues that I've had with this application, so you can see the errors here and you can click on one and see what the problem was. That would be a history of incidents and their current status. In the monitoring section, I can also add the duration monitor, so I can pick one of my steps. So let's say we choose the document generated, and we can sort of say if this takes longer than a given period of time to run. So let's say I sort of start that shape, I leave it as in progress, and then later on I'll update it with success or fail depending on how the document generated. So I can configure that to wait for 5 minutes, and if there was a problem generating the document, but an error hasn't happened yet, it's just taken a long time, we can have BAM kick in the alert sort of raising from there. You can see here as well I've got my channels, so I can configure Teams channels, ServiceNow, email, pagers, that kind of thing, Twilio. So that's how you would configure how notifications of an alert get raised. And you can also define an escalation policy that would kick in if your incidents weren't being sorted out. You can escalate them, sent to the next level of support. Exception monitor allows you to configure what to do when an error happens. So maybe you want to fire events based on the number of errors in a given time period. Send an alert on every single error, and various combinations of that. I can also, with the alerts in the queries for alerts, you can configure a note. So if I put a note in here, check the so I can kind of put a note that'll go on an alert to a support user who would be able to get some advice on how to troubleshoot this issue. So again, this is all just help that's going to make it easier for people to do a first-time resolution of a support incident or through self-service without having to raise support tickets. And then finally, the query monitor. So this is where I can define my own custom query that will be executed on a recurring basis. And if the results of that query break the thresholds that I've defined here, so you can then trigger an alert based on that query not returning the expected number of values. A good way of using this is if you have no documents generated today, that might indicate there's a potential error, so you could monitor for that condition. You could also indicate if you had too many documents generated, you might have a problem with one of your systems. Keep repeatedly sending documents out would be examples in this use case. But you can, you basically just define a query and then monitor the results of it. Let's summarize today's talk. So if we think of the key points from the presentation, BAM's really about creating this centralized view of your business processes and transactions so that you can manage them centrally. If you're building a solution with Azure or with a Power Platform, the chances are that your logic apps, your functions, your API management, your Power Automate flows, they're going to be spread across a wide estate from a deployment perspective. They're potentially in different solutions, different resource groups. That fragmented deployment model makes it difficult to manage. So managing the resources themselves is one challenge, but understanding the business process that executes across these components is an even bigger challenge. So with BAM, we create this centralized view. Your components would tell BAM what's happening, and then we can allow people to manage and self-service, which we think is one of the key messages here. So support people who are able to see that an order's been processed, troubleshoot it, and reprocess if they need to is a really key feature that we think a lot of customers are going to need. So remembering the key message here is that BAM's not just for logic apps, it's entirely possible to use it from Power Automate, data factory functions, custom code, and a bunch of other stuff. Now, once we've got your data coming into our BAM API, this allows us to light up all the features in BAM. So we have track and trace capability where you can search for transactions, you can see the data that you've sent it, you can see message bodies, you promote properties to make it easier to track. We then have action required. So when we have errors in our processes, you need a to-do list of which things have been fixed already and which things still need to be fixed. So here with action required, we get this to-do list. So I can go and mark one as being needing a resubmit, or I can mark it as we fixed it outside of the interface. We can just choose to ignore this, and we've got the governance of ignoring it and capturing a reason. Now, we also have repair and resubmit functionality. So if you allow a user, they can modify the message and they can allow that to be resubmitted with a data fix, which is sometimes required for certain interfaces. With BAM, when you set up your business processes, you would get out of the box a dashboard that tells you some of the key metrics of what's happening with that business process and its transactions. You can modify the dashboard and put your own widgets in based on your own queries and create the views that you need to help communicate an overview of what's happening with that business process. We then have monitoring, so we've got failure monitoring here, where if there's an error in your process, that can trigger our failure monitoring that'll alert somebody to come and have a look at a problem. You can have query monitoring, where you can write a query that gets executed on a recurring basis, and based on the results of that query, we can trigger alerts if there's a problem. So a really great example of how to use this would be if my interface hasn't ran today, the challenge would be there's no error that you can monitor in Azure because the interface didn't execute. There was no error, so there's nothing you can do to trigger the alert. And with query monitoring, we can look and see how many runs of this process have there been in a given time period. If it hasn't executed, then you can have that trigger an alert, and you can go and kick off a support process to handle that scenario. We also have duration monitoring, which we think is another area that's really challenging that people can't easily do with Azure. So let's say we've got a long running business process, and let's say it takes a day to run. If you get either a system that is running really slowly, or you've got an external system that hasn't returned a response message yet, if it's some kind of async, you send a message and get a response a period of time later. If that hasn't happened yet, you know you're going to have a problem at some point in the future. You just haven't seen it because there's no error. So duration monitoring can allow us to spot errors before they become errors. And again, you can execute a support process on the back of that notification and kind of recover from that issue. So those are the key things we think BAM really offers people. Now, if we think about how you can use BAM, so we said we've got all the AIS typical stuff here. We've got logic apps, API management, data factory, Synapse, Power Automate. We've got BizTalk. If a customer's migrating from BizTalk, you can use the BizTalk pack to have BAM messages sent from BizTalk pipelines, or you can use an expression shape with some custom code if you wanted to. That gets the data to our BAM, which opens up a lot of these features for you. If you happen to be a customer who uses Azure, or even if you're a customer who doesn't use Azure and you're using some other kind of integration platform, then you can still use Serverless 360 BAM. So maybe you're either an Azure customer who uses functions and Power Automate, but you don't use the logic apps. You can still use BAM. If you build your solutions with custom code, so maybe you're writing a Node.js application that has some background processes, or you're writing some, you're an IT admin writing some PowerShell scripts that run really key background processes, you can send events to BAM from those scripts in your custom code, which can allow the support team to troubleshoot these hard to manage kind of background processes in custom code. If you're using a third-party integration platform, so maybe you're using something like Boomi, SAP BTP, if you're able to make an HTTP call from your integration iPaaS, you can then make a call to BAM, and you can still use Serverless 360 BAM if you want to. So we think there's other use cases where people who aren't just natively using Azure integration services in the way they're expecting, they can still participate in using BAM to help give their business users a great experience and open up self-service of interfaces for them. Thank you very much for listening today. We hope this has been a great video that provides lots of useful content and ideas on how you can use Serverless 360 to create better integration solutions. Please reach out to us if you'd like a demo. We can show a bit more detail about how to implement things, what other features we have, chat to you about some of the challenges that you have in sort of managing real world solutions on the Azure platform. We love to get customer feedback, which helps drive some of the product innovation that we do. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.